sponsored by Skillshare. Hi guys, it's Claire, welcome back. Today I'm here to talk about all of the books that I read in the month of November, which include some novels and some books that I read for nonfiction November this year. I thought I would start with the fiction and then get into the nonfiction, so let's get into it. First up, I have Memorial by Bryan Washington, which was one of my most anticipated books of 2020. I read Bryan Washington's debut short story collection, Lot, earlier this year, and I thought it was exceptional. The writing felt so fresh and revelatory, and the quiet collective force of all of those interconnected stories just walloped me. And unfortunately, Memorial didn't have quite the same effect, even though the writing and the characters and the dialogue did feel quite reminiscent of Lot. This novel follows Benson and Mike, who are a couple living in Houston who have been together for about 4 years. Ben is a Black daycare instructor, Mike is a Japanese American chef, and their relationship already kind of feels like it's on the point of breaking when the novel opens. And then Mike gets word that his father is dying of cancer in Osaka, and then without consulting Ben, he books a ticket to Japan to go take care of his dad and potentially make amends. But just before Mike takes off, his mother, Mitsuko, arrives in Houston for an extended stay, which then puts her and Ben in this kind of awkward odd couple scenario of having to be roommates while Mike is out of town. I've heard this book described at various points as a rom-com or a dramedy or a lowercase love story, and if any of those descriptors were actually true, then I might be a little more willing to accept the unrealistic premise of Mitsuko just chilling with Ben in Houston for an indeterminate amount of time. But given the very grounded realism of the rest of the novel, the whole premise of that half of the story felt like a bit of a stretch to me. And this is where I think that Bryan Washington is more suited to short fiction than he is to long form fiction. In short fiction, you can get away with presenting a story within a limited frame, whereas a novel is more like a mural or a landscape painting where all of the various elements do have to kind of eventually flow and turn into some kind of cohesive whole. And in Memorial, it did just feel like the narrative seams holding the novel together were really showing. I also think that one of the great strengths of Bryan Washington's writing is that he is so good at capturing the essence of a feeling in these brief, crystalline moments where one character will squeeze another character's shoulder and it's this quiet gesture but loaded with meaning. He's also great at weaving in these quick flashes of the background being brought to the foreground. Women arguing on a sidewalk in Houston, or a group of kids playing soccer in an alley in Osaka. He's able to highlight these sort of peripheral moments in a way that makes his cities feel very densely populated and full of life. And there are plenty of those kinds of moments to savor throughout Memorial, much like there were in Lot. But here, it all feels held together by a much baggier narrative, and one that often felt stretched out just for the sake of making it a novel. Ben, in particular, felt like a character straight out of Lot, which made me kind of wonder why Bryan Washington needed over 150 pages to tell his half of the story, especially when his relationship with Mitsuko kind of underdelivered and didn't go anywhere that interesting. Mike's half of the novel, in contrast, did feel like more of a departure for Washington, and not just because of the Japanese setting, but also because of the more fully realized long-form storytelling. Where Ben's story is a little bit more fragmented and aimless, Mike's story at least has more of an emotional arc to it. It is kind of a classic story of someone reconciling with a parent shortly before their death, but I did find the relationship between Mike and his father quite touching, and Washington's exploration of Mike's grief and his kind of search for the meaning of home and belonging also felt like pretty fertile narrative ground. That being said, it did become apparent in this book that Washington basically has one narrative voice that he uses when writing. Ben and Mike's voices are very similar and have a lot of the same narrative or verbal tics to them. And all of the characters in the book on a dialogue level sound way too similar, even the characters who are meant to be speaking in Japanese. So that was a little bit disappointing. And then lastly, in my opinion, Ben and Mike just need to like break up. Their relationship really does feel like emotionally stunted at best and toxic at worst. So lowercase love story, this is not. I think that they both need to move on to better things and ideally better versions of themselves. Next up, I have a contemporary romance called The X-Talk by Rachel Lynn Solomon, which comes out on January 26, 2021. And this was just an absolute unequivocal delight. Of all the romances that I've read so far this year, I think this one might be my favorite. It's definitely in the top 2, and it's a book that like still fills me with warm, swoony feelings whenever I think back on it. This is technically an enemies to lovers romance between 2 co-workers at a Seattle public radio station. Shay is 29 and has been a producer at the station for the last 10 years, although she secretly harbors dreams of one day being a host. And Dominic is this new 24-year-old wonderkind with a master's in journalism who Shay resents because he's already started breaking stories on air and has basically replaced her as the station ingenue. And I say this is technically an enemies to lovers romance because the rivalry between Shay and Dominic is pretty one-sided on Shay's part and also lasts all of a few chapters before they start to kind of soften up to each other. The ice starts to melt when they are roped into / blackmailed into hosting a new radio show called The X-Talk, the premise of which is that they are friendly exes who are now offering relationship advice to other people. A far-fetched premise, yes, as is often the case in romance novels, and the journalistic ethics of it all are not awesome, but it is a pretty cute setup and allows the book to incorporate fun things into the text like tweets and podcast reviews and show transcripts, etc. And I've also found that I can forgive a lot of the kind of unlikely eye-roll plot machinations in a romance novel when the banter and dynamic between the 2 leads is really, really good, which is definitely the case here. I did find Shay a little bit annoying at first, especially her like fixation on the 5-year age gap between her and Dominic and her insistence that they're from like different generations, which is maybe technically true, but also absurd. But she did simmer down after the first few chapters, and I just found this whole book to be so sweet, but also sexy and also kind of grounded in real life shit, like Shay getting over the grief of losing her dad, or Dominic just kind of dealing with post-college loneliness. It felt true to life in a very normal and organic way, and not in the kind of self-conscious way that some romance novels like pat themselves on the back for giving their characters concerns other than romance. So anyway, I loved this one. I've been picking up other contemporary romances trying to like chase the feeling that this book gave me, and I haven't found it yet, so I very well may reread this book sometime again in the near future. Moving on to the nonfiction, I set a fairly modest nonfiction November TBR for myself, and even with that incredibly low bar, I still only managed to read one of the books on that list. But at least it was a book that I've been meaning to read for a very long time, and that is Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War by Viet Nguyen. And I thought this book was fantastic. It takes the war in Vietnam as a case study for how war machines create industries of memory that then often go on to reinforce industrial warfare. The book is divided into 3 sections that look at the ethics of memory, the industries of memory, and then the aesthetics of memory. And Viet Nguyen then uses those concepts to try to argue for a more just way of remembering and a more just way of forgetting. This is a very academic book from a university press, and so it can be a bit dense at times. There's definitely plenty of academic overwriting here, and it's reinforced, I think, a little bit too by the fact that Viet Nguyen is a very lovely and elegant writer who definitely loves to let his ideas kind of marinate in as many adjectives and beautiful turns of phrase as possible. You can tell that he just like can't help himself sometimes, and fair enough. I feel like finding writing that is that beautiful in a really academic book is quite rare, and so for the most part this was just like a pleasure to read and often quite haunting. The last paragraph of the book, for example, is this kind of understated metaphor that just like knocked the wind out of me and like still gives me chills when I think about it. And then one of the other kind of joys of reading a really well done academic book is the breadth and depth of expertise that an author brings to the subject matter. Nguyen references so many thinkers and theorists and kind of works of art surrounding the conflict in Vietnam. Works from Vietnam and America like Apocalypse Now or The Things They Carried or The Sorrow of War, but also works from places like Laos or Cambodia or the various refugee communities that were a consequence of the war. And the way that he close reads those various texts is often so sharp and illuminating, and throughout he kind of serves up these sentences that just perfectly and succinctly summarize these complicated ideas in a way that makes me forgive kind of instances of overwriting in other parts of the book. One example of that is when he's talking about how the soldier's perspective is often the lens through which we conceptualize our idea of what a war story is. And he says, thinking of war as an isolated action carried out by soldiers transforms the soldier into the face and body of war, when in truth, he is only its appendage. I do think that Nguyen's kind of ultimate argument for a utopian future where all forms of remembering and forgetting are just and equitable and ethical is a bit of a pipe dream, but I do appreciate his optimism and his argument that we should at least try to imagine different kinds of impossible futures, especially when so much of the brutality of our past and present warfare should be more impossible and unimaginable than it is. The other nonfiction book I read this month was not on my Nonfiction November TBR, but it is a book that I started well over a year ago and have been meaning to finish sometime in 2020. And that is The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, Native America from 1890 to the Present by David Treuer. So I read the first half of this book last fall, and ever since then, every time I've tried to pick it up, I haven't been able to read more than about 20 pages or so. So I finally got the audiobook out from the library as a way to kind of help me plow through the second half of it. And given that it has taken me so long to get through this book, you might not be surprised to learn that I have mixed feelings about it. This is a book that combines history and memoir and oral history to look at Native America after the 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee. And in that way, it's a direct rebuke of books like Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown, or the entire idea that Native American history and life and culture was extinguished at Wounded Knee and at the end of the 19th century. And in The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, David Treuer's constant refrain is one of the survival and endurance and resilience of Indigenous communities in America throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. It's a story of struggle, certainly, but it's also a story of strength and ingenuity and adaptation and thriving. The first 100 pages of this book does give you this broad overview of Native American history up to 1890, and I think some people have found that to be a fairly dense way to open the book, but I actually found it to be an incredibly fascinating overview of all the various tribes and communities that populated various geographic regions in what would eventually become the United States of America. As the book goes on, and particularly in the latter half of the book, as Treuer gets closer and closer to present day, he does lean more and more into the memoir and oral history elements of the book. And that's actually where the structure and methodology of the book kind of became a struggle for me. There's a lot of really interesting stuff here, but it's all fairly disorganized. You get the sense that Treuer maybe couldn't really decide on what he wanted this book to be, and instead of coalescing into a unified whole, the various elements of history, memoir, and oral history just kind of feel like a little bit of a hodgepodge. My other main issue with this book is the extent to which David Treuer quotes things at length, whether it's an LBJ speech or a piece of legislation or a monologue from one of his interview subjects. I guess I think one of the big parts of a historian's job is the selection and synthesis of sources. And I guess I just wish Treuer had done less quoting and more analysis. So I don't know, there is a lot of good stuff in here, but I feel like it could have been a little bit tighter and more streamlined, or just a little bit more cohesive, particularly the second half. I should also mention that of the other books that I had on my nonfiction November TBR, I have started listening to the audiobook of Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom by David Blight. The audiobook is like 37 hours long, and I'm currently about 25% of the way through. So on the one hand, I actually have listened to quite a bit of this, but on the other hand, I still have like a long way to go. And so far, it's a very fluid and illuminating and kind of all-encompassing biography, but it's also incredibly thorough. Not thorough to the point of dense, but thorough in a way where you just feel really like in the thick of it. Like I feel like I have already read so much about Frederick Douglass's life, and then David Blight will say something like, the 27-year-old orator, and I'm like, oh my God, he's only 27. We have so much more to get through. So I do think that by the time I'm done listening to this, my understanding of Frederick Douglass will just be like rock solid, but at the moment, I do feel a little bit in the weeds still, but I do intend to keep listening to it, so I will report back with more thoughts when I'm done. Lastly, I wanted to mention that this video is kindly sponsored by Skillshare, which is an amazing online learning platform with thousands of classes to choose from for curious and creative people who are interested in learning new skills or developing their passions. During quarantine, and especially as the weather has started to cool down, I have become a bit of a candle obsessive, and I recently got curious about how difficult it would be to try and make my own candles. So I took a Skillshare class called Candle Making Sent Your Way to Paradise, taught by John Norman. It touched on what kinds of materials you need to make your own candle, what kind of wick works best, and then I was most interested in learning about all the different ways that you can scent your candle and how you can kind of get the scent level right where you want it to be. This class, like all Skillshare classes, had an interactive project that really kind of demonstrated how easy and approachable and accessible candle making can be. Skillshare classes also connect you with a community of millions of other online learners. Courses are designed to fit your busy schedule, and Skillshare is also one of the most affordable ways to learn online, with annual premium membership coming in at less than $10 a month. If you're interested in making candles or exploring your creativity through Skillshare, the first 1,000 people to use the link in the description box below will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership. Those are all the books that I read in November. Definitely let me know if you have thoughts on any of the books mentioned here. Otherwise, let me know what you've been reading lately and if you have any good books to recommend. I hope you're all staying safe and well. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!